Okay, this is where we stopped off, and this is where all of your attention and stick-to-itiveness to these videos is going to pay off. As I said, the temple had its own 490 due to David, due to the 2 Samuel 7 contract, which eventuated in the 1 Kings 9 contract. And that contract began at its dedication in 950 BC and would end 490 years later, depending on how the people voted, in 460 BC. Okay, that's this temple, and unfortunately it's going to go down 126 years prior to its time grant due to Israel not observing her sabbatical years. Now, before I go through that, because that's the backdrop of the direct backdrop of Psalm 90 verses 16 and 17, because they're moaning about the temple being down. Before that happens, I want you to see how David's own time grants undergird and protect this problem of the temple going down. Remember, there's always an underlying 490. Okay, and it's coming from David. Alright, let's just walk through these, okay? Let's put up the calculator again. I'll put it up over here. I want you to pay attention to the numbers in column E. Okay, E99 through E105. Okay? We're going to look at E100. That's David's first crowning at Hebron. Okay? That minus 490 would end at 520 BC. So the temple going down in 586 is protected by that 490. Okay? In 520 BC. You might want to write that down because this gets really complicated as we come closer and closer to Purim. Alright? You got also his retirement from kingship, which is 40 years later, in 970 BC, and that minus 490 years means that 490 runs out in 480 BC. Now you'll notice the 520 and 480 BC are all both before 460 BC when the temple's contract runs out. That's important. The temple going down before 460 BC means that its whole life depends on whether there's a time grant from David still operating. And right now we've just found out that his retirement, 490, runs out in 480 BC, which is a little longer than 520 BC. You with me? Okay, God's justice is very exacting. And that's what we're learning here. Okay, so then we got David's time grant from his kingship over all Israel, which for rounded purposes we'll say is 103 BC, and that minus 490 is 513. So that's in between. So you got 520, 513, and 480. Okay, you're going to need those dates, so write them all down. 520, 513, and 480. These are when David's time grants for the 490 run out. So long as the temple is protected by one of them, the temple can be rebuilt. This is something scholars didn't understand about the temple's rebuilding 490. Where was it justified? How could it come from? They just assumed that because God says so, it must be okay. No, God has already provided the reason why. And Daniel already knows it, but unfortunately we Christians don't, and the Jews forgot. It's kind of criminal that we don't know this, but we're going to know it now. Okay? So, the last time grant is the latest one. It's going to end with the latest date in David's life, which is his death. That was 963 BC, and that ends 490 years later. And this is really important. Be sure to write this down if you didn't write down the others. 473 BC. So there's the latest time grant of David of the 490s ends at 473 BC. Each time grant offers protection, justification for protection of Israel. This last one, ending in 473 BC, is the reason why there was protection even when Israel almost died due to Purim. This one, the 473 BC is the year after Purim. Otherwise, Jerusalem couldn't have been rebuilt, and that's directly bearing on Psalm 90 verses 16 and 17. And Isaiah is going to be talking back to it. So that's why these numbers are really important. You're seeing the meter, you're seeing the verse, but this is the history that the meter and the verse is talking about, which every Jew at that time knew, and they don't know that today. Okay, 473 BC is the latest then, which is 490 years after row 99, David's death. Okay, you following me on that? So therefore, here's the temple dedicated in 950 BC. It has a time grant that ends in 460 BC, which is actually later than even the latest of David's time grants. Okay? The latest of David's time grants ends 473 BC. The temple's time grant would end at 460. Do you understand now why? Because then it outlives David's 490s and has a 490 of its own for that reason, because the temple was a promise to David. And so long as Israel observed, according to the contract of 1 Kings 9, that temple would stay standing until Messiah. Alright, that was the idea. But unfortunately, Israel missed her sabbatical years, so the temple goes down in 586. Now, let's have a look at what 586 is relative to history. And I can't show it all, so you're going to have to just keep this number in mind. Oh, here, I got a shorter way to depict it. See, temple started 950, dies 586. This is the voting window that Psalm 90 verses 16 and 17 is talking to. This is what people are saying during this voting window. Okay? But, and here's when David's time grant runs out, and here's when Purim occurs. 1 year before David's last time grant. So if the temple is not rebuilt by this time, okay, then there isn't going to be any time. Okay? So how do you bridge? And this is the precedent for the rapture, and this is the precedent that Paul actually uses in Ephesians 1, 3 through 14. Paul patterns Ephesians 1, 3 through 14 from Daniel 9. The whole thing is patterned from it. He's playing Daniel. He's saying church is like Daniel. That's his whole rhetorical focus. So that's why you got to get this. The temple goes down in 586. Okay, how do you bridge from 586 when the temple goes down to the voting period that's needed in order for Israel to continue? Because remember, the temple's own 490 would have ended within that voting period, so then Israel obviously would be voting again in 460 through 396, because remember, Israel does the voting. Israel votes. She's doing it through sabbatical years, but the sabbatical years tie to true historical voting periods, just like they always have since Adam. And the temple's voting period would end, in a voting period for that reason. So Israel would have to be voting again for the temple to remain standing. Okay, but it's already destroyed here in row 132. How's it going to get to row 144 when it's already gone here? Well, one of the reasons it could keep, God could say to Jeremiah, like he does in Jeremiah 25, is that, that he's going to give 70 more years, is because David's got a 490 running from his Hebron kingship that lasts until 520. And the second temple is going to resume construction the year before. Notice that link. This is how important this stuff is. See, this is an amount of blessing. If time is granted, then things that go with time in order for time to be a blessing are granted. Okay, so that Israel can have enough blessing to rebuild the temple, despite the fact that it's her fault it goes down. David's time grant from his Hebron kingship started then, ends in 520. Temple construction begins the year before. Next deadline, David from his united kingship, 513 BC is when it ends. Temple is dedicated 3 years before. You see how David's time grants are protecting the rebuilding of the temple, and that's how God can bridge time. Because there's a time grant given David. And it's bridging time. Here, for temple to start again, it's bridging time. That's why God can grant 70 years, because he's got a 490 that's already done by David that lasts 3 years beyond the 70 years. And then he grants a second 70 years, which scholars don't know about, that ends in 446. And the reason he can do that is because the temple is rebuilt here, and because David's last time grant runs out a year after Purim, and that's why he can justify rescuing Israel at Purim. You know, because Israel isn't positive then either. I mean, Mordecai was a kind of a putz. He was making a big stink about being Jewish in front of the gates of the king. And then he tells Esther to hide it. But, excuse me, Esther's supposed to talk to him every day because he's her uncle? What, the king's not going to know about that? Mordecai was a jerk. A real jerk. Haman was a bigger jerk. I mean, you know, they were all jerks. And Esther's got to hide the fact she's Jewish. You know, she didn't really do that. Or she couldn't really do that. The king would know better. All right? So, but still, David's time grant is protecting them. They're in trouble. Even though the temple's up, they're in trouble. And of course, because the temple's up, everybody's trying to get it destroyed again. And that's why Purim is even an issue. But you see the basis for the time grant here? 70 years is granted because David has 490 still running. And God is, as he always kept saying, he is, loyal to his servant David. For the sake of my servant David, I will, keep Israel going in spite of the bad kings and the bad people. Okay? This is why. This is what he's talking about. David got the time grants. And notice how they're tied to very important events in Israel's history. And you can even argue that Satan kind of tried to make those events occur because he knew that the time grant would, go. But that's sort of speculation. I mean, I don't really know who's responsible for making this go. Of course, you got to argue Satan is there. He had to have a hand in it somehow. But see, this is where the 586 is okay, because it's got a time grant from David. And you'll notice that this is all occurring after 3150. Okay, because David's dead. And so this is the history of the kings, starting with the nasty Rehoboam. And this is just Judah's kings. I didn't list the Israel's, Samaria's kings. Alright? And they have, sort of checkered history. Hezekiah was, in some ways, the worst king Israel ever had. In some ways, the best king she had, other than David. It's his fault that the temple ends up going down, because he basically invited the new Babylonians to come see his wealth, and as soon as they saw it, they started making plans for taking him over. And that's what is recorded by Isaiah at the end of Isaiah 39. Okay? So the temple goes down. Okay? And Psalm 90, verses 16 and 17 are talking to this voting period. Now, we got to cover the 14 and the 56 again. The temple is going down 586, It was supposed to last until 460, as you can see. Okay? It's supposed to last until 460, but it goes down at 586. So 586 minus 460, which was its allotment, is 126 years. Okay? So 126 years before the temple goes down, Isaiah writes Isaiah 53. And so you have, and I did this in the video, if you hadn't seen it already, you'll see it now. Here's Isaiah 53:1 is who has believed our report. Okay, that's Isaiah 53:1 right there. And this is 126 syllables, at the end of which is the temple going down. Right here at the end of verse 4, the last clause in verse 4 ends at 586 BC. Isaiah is writing in 712 BC. You know that because he starts Isaiah 53, which starts in Isaiah 52:13 in English. He starts this at David's birth. David's birth. Okay? So David's birth was 1040 BC. So Isaiah does what Moses does. He does a chronology, an annual chronology, beginning at David's birth. So this 52:13, his suffering servant is a king, namely David, to give rise to the last David, and Isaiah 53 is about first David to last David. And every Jew who's a real Jew knows that. Okay, that's the whole point. The servant is the king. The promised king who will deliver Israel. It is never Israel herself. Israel voted against God, see? Right up here. Israel doesn't inherit herself. It has to come through her king now. And so it's a question of, okay, when is the promised final king, Messiah, going to come? He's going to come from David, the king. So 53 is always about a person. It's about a king. It's about him ruling. That's what Isaiah 53:12 says. He, the king, will inherit. Just like David inherited. Okay, the last king will inherit. Alright, so the last king inherits. Alright, starting with David's birth in 1040 BC. And right here, this point here, there's an ellipsis of 252 years between Isaiah 52:15 and 53:1. 53:1 picks up at 712 BC and goes straight chronology down to Isaiah 53:11 between verses 10 and 11, and there is another hiatus of 364 years, which corresponds to the number of years the temple would have been standing. Okay? See, the temple dies. It goes from 950 to 586. That's 364 years. In the annual chronology of the syllables, the march of the syllables, that is occurring here. Okay? This corresponds to the 62 weeks of Daniel. The 62 weeks of Daniel are the sum of 364 and the last 70 syllables in Isaiah. That is exactly the same corresponding time that Moses is talking about in Psalm 90 verses 16 and 17. Isaiah is mapping to Moses. Isaiah is picking up the annual chronology where Moses leaves off. Moses leaves off at Israel rejecting her king. So the king that is promised by God to replace Saul is where Isaiah picks up the chronology. And so he picks it up here, stops it here when David is 77 years old and therefore dies, puts in the extra 252 years, which is sevenths, okay, so that the total poem, including the elliptical years, are 154 sevenths, which is twice 77. And Christ, the 77th son from Adam, which is in the Luke 3 roster, Luke deliberately plots out 77 sons, is a play on all this. You got doubled 77s from first David to last David, including the ellipsis years. And 126 years before the temple is going to go down, that's when Isaiah writes this. And at this point, the second 126 is the number of years the temple is short. Again, okay, 950 minus 586 is 364 minus 460. Oops, I did it wrong. 586 minus 950. The temple is 120. Oops. 950 minus 586 minus 460. I'm not doing this right. It's 126 years short of the deadline. Okay. 586, there we go, minus 460. This is what I get for making too many videos in a row. 126 years short. So, 126 years short. That's the basis for Daniel 9. God is basically retrieving these 126 missed years, going to recredit them if Israel rebuilds her temple. Okay, if she rebuilds by 70 years. And he can grant the 70 years because David's got time grants that haven't run out yet. Okay, now, I'm sorry all this lead in. The 70 years is not what the scholars tell you. Some ding-dong who had the arrogance to call himself Eusebius is considered a church father and was one of the many church fathers who were all spiritual retards. Eusebius decided that because there were 70 years in a 490, and because there were 70 years in Jeremiah for the sabbatical years, that somehow Israel had been alive for 490 years at that point. And so he backdates. He slaps on 490 years, okay, to come up with a start date of 1076. He never read his Bible. That's all I can say. He didn't know how to read. He was a jackass. I'm sorry. You don't just look. You don't just add. This is what he did. 586 plus 490 means Israel started in 1076 BC. Yeah, that was the same mistake I made. But I'm a brainout. He's supposed to be a church father. Yeah, well, he was a brainout, obviously. Okay, Israel didn't start in 1076 BC. Okay, Israel started in 1440 BC. Duh. Okay, so she wasn't 490 years old at the time. And the temple went up in 950 BC, which anybody reading 1 Kings 6:1 or 1 Kings 8 or 1 Kings 9 could have calculated. I did. So, what the hell is the 70 years then? Because, see, the temple was up 364 years before it went down. Okay. That's not 490. Duh. Okay, so divide by 7, and what is it? 52. Okay, but that's not even really right. Because it was under Rehoboam that there was this argument that went on. Okay? A fight. Rehoboam was such a bad king that the other 10 tribes split off under Jeroboam. And that's when Israel stopped observing her sabbatical years. Okay, so now let's have a look at that. That was 930. Okay, so we go 9302586. That's 344 years. Divided by 7 is 49 sabbatical years. Okay, 49. 49. Now watch. We do it again. How many calculators do I have up now that I didn't pull down? Okay, there we go. Okay, 49 missed sabbatical years. 49. Okay, now, this can't be too hard to understand. They're all sabbatical years and they have to elapse. But if there's 49 of them, then more sabbatical years are due on them. Namely, 49 divided by 7 equals 7. Okay, now you know where the 56 is coming from. Okay, 49 sabbatical years plus 7 more due is 56. It's really important. This is how Paul opens up Ephesians 1, 3 through 4. And this is how Moses ended. Remember? This is how Moses ended. Oops. How Moses ended. Oops. Where is it? Yeah, here we go. I'm going to have a look at how Moses ended. Psalm 90 with 56 syllables. Now you're finding out why. Okay? Because there are 56 years due that Israel was going to blow it and miss. Okay, see. Verses 16 and 17 have 56 syllables. Alright? 56. She's going to miss 14 of the 70 years are not going to be there because she missed already her sabbatical years to the tune of not just 49, but the 7 additional years due on them. This is the origin of the tribulational 7. If she only missed 49 years, but there's 56 years due because of the extra sabbatical years on the 49, then she's only got 49 years to get reimbursed. So the extra 7 can't play in her history. You either played them right the first time or you can't play them at all in her timeline. So the tribulation has to happen after Israel's time is up. This is the origin of it. That is why Moses is saying, 56, warning, Bill Robinson, there's a 56, which means, and of course he explained it. And, therefore, the 49 years you see reimbursed, not 56, but 49, you see reimbursed in Daniel 9, takes you to here. Okay? So that's why Isaiah keeps stressing 56. 56, just like Moses had done. Warning Bill Robinson, and 56 is therefore becomes a metaphorical number of apostasy. The 49 missed sabbatical years plus the 7 years that can't be made up. And this is the origin of the tribulation. It's a balance sheet problem. Israel didn't vote. The sabbatical years you voted to learn God. So during the sabbatical years you were not allowed to work for the entire year. You had a whole year's vacation. This is why a lot of people wanted to go and live in Israel. Oh golly, I get a whole year's vacation. Yeah, and you're not allowed to work. You were supposed to spend that time studying the Word as you then had it, which of course it was being gradually given out. That was what it was for. You had a whole year off just to study. That's where we get our modern day term of sabbatical year. In a sabbatical year, a professor goes to write a book or something. He takes time off from work so he can focus on study. That's the origin of it. It's coming from, this was the purpose of the sabbatical year for the Jews. And there was nothing like it anywhere in the world. What? You have a whole year where all you do is study a religious book? Yeah. That's what made Israel different. That's what made nations hate her. Because, they're not working for a whole year. And yet their land is blessed. And yet they have crops. And they're not working for it. And they're getting something for nothing. People always are jealous when you get something better than they have. I don't know why. But they are. Okay? So this was why her years went down. It was 49 missed sabbatical years. It was 344 years since Rehoboam that she didn't do what she was supposed to do and take off every 7th year and study Bible. So the temple goes down, and in the 49th year, after the temple has been down, which is right here, 538, okay, Daniel prays to God. And in Daniel 9:24, God, not a human king, God decrees that it be rebuilt. Okay? There is a Cyrus, and Cyrus was predicted by God in Isaiah 45. But God had decreed it in 586 BC before Cyrus even came around. And you know that because that's in Daniel 9. Also, Daniel 9:24 to be precise. Daniel 9:25 is the decree that is decreed in Daniel 9:24. See, 77s have been decreed. By who? God. And then Daniel 9:25 is how those 77s play out. Duh. Okay? So, this is what's behind the 14 that's reserved up here. And it's cut out here. And it's pregnantly at 56 because that represents the 49 missed sabbatical years that Moses knows in advance will occur, and Israel's being warned about them, plus the 7 years due on them, which will result in the time of Jacob's trouble, aka the tribulation. That would have played had Israel accepted Christ or not. And in the next segment we'll see how it would have played, because then you'll understand more about what this is, and then when I read the translation to you, it'll really make sense.